A close reading of the work will tell you that this is a comic work, and I want to look at just the way in which Alice Walker uses a kind of comedy to begin to open up the possibility that there is a mockery in many ways of a misguided Afrocentrism throughout the work, and I think this is really one of the important things. I mean, it's worth sort of looking at the passage. Dee sees the mother, and of course Maggie. When Dee comes in, Maggie falls back right up against the back of my chair, and I feel her trembling there. When I look up, I see the perspiration falling off her chin. That is Maggie. Don't get up, says Dee. Since I'm stout, it takes something of a push. You can see me trying to move a second or two before I make it. She turns, showing white heels through her sandals, and goes back to the car. Out she peeks next with a Polaroid. She stoops down quickly and snaps off picture after picture of me sitting there in front of the house with Maggie cowering behind me. She never takes a shot without making sure the house is included. And when a cow comes nibbling around the edge of the yard, she snaps it and me and Maggie and the house. Then she puts the Polaroid in the back seat of the car and comes up and kisses me on the forehead. Meanwhile, Assalamu alaikum is going through motions with Maggie's hand. Maggie's hand is as limp as a fish and probably as cold despite the sweat, and she keeps trying to pull it back. It looks like Assalamu alaikum wants to shake hands but wants to do it fancy, or maybe he don't know how people shake hands, and anyhow, he soon moves on, gives up on Maggie. Well, I say, D. No, Mama, she says, not D. Wangeru Lewanika Komanjo. What happened to Dee? I wanted to know. She's dead, Wanjeru says. I couldn't bear it any longer, being named after the people who oppress me. You know as well as me, you was named after your aunt Dilsey. I said, Dilsey is my sister. She named Dee. We called her Big D after Dee was born. But who was she named after? Asked Wanjeru. I guess from Grandma D, I said. And who was she named after? Asked Wanjeru. Her mother, I said, and I saw Wanjeru was getting tired. That's about as far back as I can trace it. I said, though in fact, I probably could have carried it back beyond the Civil War through the branches. Well, said Assalamu alaikum, there you are. I heard Maggie say, there I was not, I said, before DC cropped up in our family, so why should I try to trace it that far back? He just stood there grinning, looking down on me like somebody inspecting a Model A car. Every once in a while, he and Wangeru sent eye signals over my head. How do you pronounce his name? This name, I asked. You don't have to call me by it. You don't want, if you don't want to, said Wangeru. Why wouldn't I asked. If that's what you want us to call you, we'll call you. I know it might sound awkward at first, said Wanjeru. I'll get used to it. Ream it out again. Now, it's a very interesting conversation because, of course, we've talked about this idea of tracing the history of the name, but this is a first name and not a last name. And of course, what the mother is saying is that I actually know the heritage of our family, and I can go as far back as you want me to go back. So Dee is taking up an argument that she has learned from somebody else. But what she doesn't realize is that the very purpose of being able to trace back one's ancestry is the goal. It's the tragedy of losing that. But in fact, in their case, the mother knows that ancestry. In fact, the keeping of the quilt, all these rituals, trying to suggest that not all African American history and of all African American knowledge of themselves has been destroyed by racism or by slavery, but some have been retained. And in this mother, there is that thing. Rather than de-recognizing the value of that, the value of her ancestry, the value of generation after generation, and that the name that she's gotten comes from her own people and the names of her own people, Dee takes the position that using the name D is using a slave name, but this is an exaggeration of the problem and an exaggeration of the issue. There's also this comic moment where Assalamu alaikum or Hakim is trying to shake hands, black hand style, with Maggie, and Maggie, of course, can't do it. So there's a sense in which there's an urban difference, there's an urban kind of hipness and so on that is there, and the mother recognizes these problems. This is so so Alice Walker is critiquing Afrocentrism, even though she would not simply say that Afrocentrism is a bad thing. This would be unlike Alice Walker, who herself was somebody who was believed in, had connections with the idea of connecting with Africa and so on. But what she's suggesting is the purpose of Afrocentrism is to recognize the African American presence in the world and to recognize that there's a history behind the African American presence. And of course, therefore, this is where we face the big decision about the quilt. And in the quilt situation, she finally does say that she's going to give the quilt to Maggie. And when she makes that decision, which is a very powerful moment in the story, because when we get to that moment in the story, it's worth reading it. Here's Maggie, angry. Um, the mother says, when I looked at her like that, something hit me in the top of my head and ran down to the soles of my feet. Just like when I'm in church and the Spirit of God touches me and I get happy and I shout. I did something I never done before. I hugged Maggie to me, then dragged her on into the room, snatched the quilts out of Miss Vergeru's hand and dumped them into Maggie's lap. Maggie just sat there on my bed with her mouth open. Take one or two of the others, I said to Dee. But she turned without a word and went out to Hakim Ababar. You just don't understand, said Maggie. And I came out to the car. What don't I understand? I wanted to know. Your heritage, she said. And then she turned to Maggie, kissed her, and said, you ought to try to make something of yourself too, Maggie. It's really a new day for us. But from the way you and Mama still live, you'd never know it. She put on some sunglasses that had everything above the tip of her nose and chin. That hid everything above her tip of her nose and chin. Maggie smiled maybe at the sunglasses, but a real smile, not scared. After we watched the car dust settle, I asked Maggie to bring me a dip of snuff, and then the two of us sat there, just enjoying until it was time to go in the house and go to bed. So there's this moment where the mother makes the decision and she says it should go to Maggie. And when Dee says, of course, you don't understand your heritage, that is Alice Walker's point that, of course, the very opposite of this is true. The mother demonstrates a knowledge of her heritage. She understands the history of her heritage and so on. And Dee's apparent interest in heritage is not real, it's superficial. What will she do with the quilts? She will hang them up to be seen as a work of art. And what would Maggie do with the quilt? She would use them for everyday use.